Friends of PISAI, on behalf of the professors and staff of PISAI, I would like to welcome all of you to this evening's lecture. I am Father Diego Sarrio, the Dean of Studies of PISAI. Our rector, Don Valentino Cottini, cannot be with us right now, but he will join us later. This evening's lecture is the first in our series of public lectures for 2017-2018. The lecture, as you have seen, is sponsored by Georgetown University as part of an ongoing collaboration that began 2 years ago and for which we are very grateful. This evening we have with us Dr. John Borelli, who is a special assistant for Catholic Identity and Dialogue to President John O of Georgetown University. He is also the coordinator for Dialogue and Relations for the Jesuit Conference of the United States and Canada. He is not a Jesuit himself. I precisely. So I have asked Dr. Borelli to say a few words and then to introduce our speaker this evening, Professor Tamara SONN.
Thank you very much, Father Diego, and welcome to you all for this evening's lecture. This is the second Georgetown lecture on contemporary Islam, and we are delighted that we're able to do this. Formally, we've had a formal relationship between the university and the Pontifical Institute for these 2 years, and we have a formal memorandum of understanding that we're going to re-sign now for 3 years. We were on probation, but they upped it to another year this time. So we're glad that we meet their accreditation requirements. But we've had good relationships for decades among the people involved at Georgetown and the staff here and the professors here. In fact, the Dean of Studies is one of our doctoral products in our comparative program of theology with religious studies. And that's when I first met Father Diego, when he was studying at our campus. So this is an ongoing relationship. Not only do we have a doctoral program in theology that you can specialize in Islam and Christianity and do a comparative study, but we also have a Center for Muslim Christian Understanding. We have a doctoral program in Islamic Studies. And as the notice for today's public lecture indicates, Professor Tamara SONN is the Hamad Bin Khalifa Al-Thani Professor in the History of Islam at our Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. Professor SONN is currently, as some of you know, and will be meeting the requirements for, teaching a short course this month, 3-week course here at the Pontifical Institute. Now, prior to joining us at Georgetown on the faculty, Professor SONN was for many, many years on the faculty of the College of William and Mary, a public research university in historic Williamsburg, Virginia. William and Mary was founded in colonial times, 1693, almost 100 years before Georgetown University was founded, which we like to give as 1789, the same year that the Republic was formed too, besides Georgetown. And we are the oldest Jesuit and Catholic university in the United States. Professor SONN studied at Santa Clara University as an undergraduate, which is another one of our Jesuit schools. Her most recent books include Islam and Democracy After the Arab Spring, a book that she did with John Esposito and John Voll, Islam, History, Religion, and Politics, and the title for today's lecture is Islam, an Enemy of the West. Is that why you came? Maybe I should just get out of the way and we listen to her. I wanted to say that some of her books, in particular, her Brief History of Islam is now in its 3rd edition, and it's been translated too, has it not? So it's quite an important resource for the study of Islam. We have been friends for many years. She served on the advisory board for our Center for Muslim Christian Understanding at Georgetown, and she often offered advisory comments when I needed help in my previous job at the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, where I was in charge of interreligious relations, especially promoting Christian-Muslim relations. I depended on scholars such as Tamara to help me understand precisely a particular issue or set of developments in the world. More can be said about her excellent work and illustrious career, but let me just say that she is just a wonderful person too, a very fine person to know, delightful person. She is part of a reading group that I sponsor in the President's office, which meets monthly during the academic year. So without further ado, I think we're going to take on this question: is Islam an enemy of the West? Professor Sonn.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you, Father Diego, and thank you so much, Dr. Borelli. I'm slightly speechless. It was very, very generous introduction. I shall try not to disappoint. Thank you so much. And thank you all for being here. It is a joy and an honor to be here. I see many familiar faces in here, and I'm looking forward to a discussion with all of us after I give my comments. I think we have 2 hours, correct? I want to make sure that everyone is able to hear me. Everyone is able to hear? Everyone is able to hear, Jason? No. Get a little bit closer. Sí. Pues? Okay. Good. A little bit better? Great. Thank you. So, our title, a very strange title, isn't it? Is Islam an enemy of the West? The question itself is extremely strange. Very strange. How can an ancient global religion be an enemy of a modern geopolitical construct? How can that work? But if you pay attention to social media, there seems to be good reason to think that Islam is an enemy of the West, which is why this title was assigned to me by my publisher for a book. This is what they were laughing at. I held it up when you said the title. In a series called Global Futures. The publisher is Polity Press in the UK. Global Futures, Great Questions of the 21st Century. Let me give you some of the other questions, the other titles in this series. Is the EU doomed? By Jan Zielonka. Should we fear Russia? By Dmitry Trenin. Is the American Century over? By the revered scholar Joseph S. Nye, Jr. Should rich nations help the poor? By David Home. Can the welfare state survive? By Andrew Gamble. Will China dominate the 21st century? By Jonathan Fenby. Can financial markets be controlled? By Howard Davies. And is Islam an enemy of the West? So this question figures very highly in the popular imagination. All of those other questions seem reasonable to me. I'm not an expert in those fields. The question seems ridiculous to me because I am an expert in this field. The question is Islam an enemy of the West? So let's talk about that. Where does the question come from? It obviously comes from attacks and threats of further attacks from terrorists who claim that their religion commands them to either convert everyone to Islam or kill them. These threats are all over the cybersphere. The attacks and the threats cause fear of Islam among people who know nothing other than the threats and the attacks, who know nothing other than the headlines. And that began even before 9/11. Most of us became aware of international terrorism with the 9/11 attacks against the United States in the year 2001. But those threats and those fears began to emerge long before that. Every year, for example, Iran commemorates the 1979 revolution that brought it to power, the current government to power. Every year that revolution is celebrated with marches in the streets, Mar Bar America, Death to America, and those are broadcast worldwide. The leader of the 1979 revolution in Iran, Ayatollah Khomeini, called the US the Great Satan. When Osama bin Laden founded Al-Qaeda in the late 1980s, it was specifically to fight the United States, because he believed that the United States was behind all the troubles in Muslim-majority countries. In 1996, bin Laden issued a message, widely disseminated, a message declaring war on the Americans occupying the land of the two holy places, meaning Saudi Arabia, where the US had just stationed troops following the Kuwait Gulf War. In 1998, bin Laden issued another message, this time ordering Muslims worldwide to kill Americans and their allies, both civilian and military, and to take their money too. He said it was the duty of every able-bodied Muslim in any country. American troops are doing the work of the devil, he said. And since the United States is a democracy, government for, by, and of the people, all Americans must take responsibility for their government's policies. Less than 6 months later, Al-Qaeda operatives detonated truck bombs in embassies in two embassies in East Africa, killing over 200 people. After 9/11, bin Laden was going public again, gloating over the successful terrorist attacks in New York and Washington. He warned Americans that their crusade, and he used the word, their crusade was doomed to failure because history shows that Muslims destroy evil empires, a phrase used by the US President Ronald Reagan in 1983 to refer to the Soviet Union. Bin Laden took credit on behalf of Islam for destroying the Soviet Union because Muslims were the fighters in the war to drive out the Soviet Union after it invaded Afghanistan in the 1980s. He then predicted that the United States, if the United States does not change its policies, the Muslim world would destroy it next, actually. The 9/11 atrocities killed nearly 3,000 people, and those attacks were followed by terrorist attacks in Madrid, as you know, in 2004, killing nearly 200, in London in 2005, killing over 50 people. Neither of those attacks happened to be claimed by Al-Qaeda, but they were undoubtedly inspired by them. In 2007, bin Laden sent another letter to the United States, widely disseminated online, calling the US the worst civilization witnessed in human history. It's the United States, in his estimation, called another letter to America, published November 24th, 2007. And since 9/11, anti-Western Muslim groups or groups taking Islamic identity seem to have multiplied. In 2002, the Nigerian terrorist group Boko Haram burst upon the scene. They started out calling for strict Islamic law in poverty-stricken northern Nigeria. But within a few years, they were calling for control of all of Nigeria, which is, of course, Africa's largest country. In 2015, Boko Haram upped the ante, announcing that Nigeria was just the beginning. From there, they would expand all the way across Africa and use it as a base to take over the entire world. Boko Haram, this terrorist gang in northern Nigeria, going to take over the world. Anyone who doesn't submit to their law, they said, either had to die or become a slave. Boko Haram has pledged allegiance to the most successful terrorist group to date, the Islamic State, formerly known as Al-Qaeda in Iraq, ISIL, ISIS. I usually call it ISIS because it's easier to remember. ISIS, founded in Iraq after the US-led invasion of that country in 2003. ISIS leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi insists that his group is the vanguard for global Islamic domination. Islam, he says, is locked in a final showdown with disbelief. This echoes language that was published initially in 1996, Clash of Civilizations. Clash of Civilizations hypothesis advanced by Samuel Huntington, who said that this Harvard political scientist who predicted an inevitable clash between these two civilizations with conflicting values. The time for peace is over, said Baghdadi, until the entire world submits to Islamic law as he interprets it, his own very unique, narrow interpretation of Islamic law, and until the entire world submits to that, Muslims must wield the sword. That's the way it must be until Yom Adin, until the day of judgment. And there have been many subsequent attacks: Paris, Brussels, Boston, San Bernardino, Barcelona, Manchester, Nice, New York. The list goes on, and those are routinely associated with ISIS. So no wonder people who only know headlines or only know the discourse of terrorists think Islam is an enemy of the West, or wonder at least. They're afraid. If that's all you know, you're afraid. Leader of the Dutch right-wing party for freedom, Geert Wilders, for example, called the Quran the Islamic Mein Kampf. He wants it banned in the Netherlands. Like the US President, Wilders also wants Muslim immigration stopped completely. Otherwise, he says, within 20 years, Muslims will control the continent of Europe and impose their sick and fascist ideology. He says that Islam is at war with the West. This is Wilders. He says that Islam is at war with the West. French politician Marine Le Pen agrees. She also wants to end Muslim immigration from France's former colonies in North Africa. She says that Muslim immigration from North Africa is like the Nazi occupation. It threatens the very survival of French civilization, she says. American blogger Robert Spencer, founder of Jihad Watch, an online group that monitors scholars of Islam and other people. He warns that the U.S. is preparing the way for its own destruction by allowing Muslims into the country. This is the U.S. Muslims in the U.S. are carrying out a stealth jihad, he says, a project to impose post-Nazi, his words, post-Nazi, post-Stalinist, a totalitarian state making all non-Muslims legal inferiors. In 2010, Spencer co-founded with the American Freedom Defense Initiative with a political activist named Pamela Geller. Their campaign is called Stop the Islamization of America, you see. In 2015, American political commentator Glenn Beck, who used to have a cable TV show, I'm not sure if it's still on. Glenn Beck, he was very well known, published a book called It Is About Islam. It is about Islam, he said, exposing the true Islamic plan to take over the world. Beck says it's not just extremists who are the threat. He says that Islam, the religion, and its scripture, the Quran, call for the subjugation of all non-Muslims and condemn all non-Muslims to hell for eternity. This is Glenn Beck's analysis. The reason, he says, is that the siege against America is underway today, so we must all be on guard. The executive chairman of a very popular alt-right online site, Breitbart, Steve Bannon, believes that the Judeo-Christian West, I'm quoting, is locked in a struggle for survival against barbarian Islam that will completely eradicate everything that we've been bequeathed over the past 2,000 to 2,500 years. I'm quoting from a transcript of comments that Bannon delivered via Skype to a conference hosted by the Human Dignity Institute in Vatican City in 2014. The Judeo-Christian West is locked in a struggle for survival against barbarian Islam that will completely eradicate everything we've been bequeathed for the past 2,000 to 2,500 years. So yes, people who know only the headlines and social media posts have reason to be afraid. If this is all you know of Islam, you have reason to be afraid, very afraid, or at least extremely confused. But if you look beyond the headlines, there are good reasons not to believe that Al-Qaeda, Boko Haram are Islamic leaders, that they represent Islam, the religion of over 1.7 billion people on earth. For one thing, the vast majority of the victims of Muslim terrorists are Muslims. Iraq, Pakistan, Syria, Afghanistan, Somalia, Nigeria, the vast majority of the victims of terrorism in those countries are Muslims. For another reason, the United States has, and other European countries, I shouldn't say other, United States and European countries have strong and lasting relationships with numerous Muslim countries, have had for decades. Saudi Arabia, UAE, Jordan, Morocco, Egypt, Pakistan, Indonesia, Malaysia, Uzbekistan, Bahrain, Kuwait, Tajikistan, Qatar, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Turkey. These are all huge Muslim majority countries. Strong, lasting bilateral relations. We actually have military bases in many of those countries, Kuwait, Afghanistan, Bahrain, Qatar, Turkey, and have had for years. And yet we're still here. We haven't been destroyed. We actually have a mercenary base now in UAE, recently established by the inheritor, whatever is the most recent name of Blackwater, which is active in providing support for the Saudi-led war in Yemen. So that's another reason not to assume that the Boko Haram, ISIS, and Al-Qaeda leaders speak for Muslims worldwide. But the most obvious reason to recognize that Islam is not an enemy of the West is that mainstream Muslims overwhelmingly reject terrorism. In 2008, a Gallup poll published the results, the Gallup company published the results of the most extensive opinion poll ever taken among the Muslim public worldwide. Data from thousands of Muslims in each of 35 countries showed that well over 90% condemned the 9/11 attacks. That was the way the question was framed. This was in 2008. Well over 90% condemned the terrorist attacks as unjustified. The 7% who said they were at least partially justified gave political, not religious reasons for their answer. And these results have been replicated in numerous public opinion polls since then. Those polls, demographically, reflect the views of mainstream Muslims and religious authorities who unanimously condemn terrorism. Their statements don't make headlines the way the terrorist threats and attacks do. People often ask, why don't Muslims condemn terrorism? You are telling me that Muslims condemn terrorism. Why don't Muslims condemn terrorism? Actually, they do, frequently and publicly. But people tend not to access those proclamations. Muslim religious authorities denounced terrorism beginning publicly, that is, they began to recognize after 9/11 that those terrorist attacks that had already happened were actually part of a growing movement. Muslims themselves were taken by surprise, and they realized there's a trend going on here. We must take a stand and begin to try to understand it ourselves, find out where this terrorism comes from, but we must begin by making public announcements of the antipathy of Islamic values toward terrorism. University of North Carolina sociologist Charles Kurtzman maintains did maintain a website. It's still online. It hasn't been updated for about the past 10 years, but beginning after 9/11, cataloging the condemnations of terrorism. Those statements include views, these are the official statements, not just generic Muslims, not student groups, not civil society groups. Those statements are also available. But these are statements on the Kurtzman website that represent the views of Muslim religious authorities worldwide. It includes views of leaders of Egypt's Muslim Brotherhood, Palestine's Hamas, Tunisia's Nahda movement, and counterparts throughout the Muslim majority world. I'll quote some of them. We condemn in the strongest terms the incidents of 9/11, which are against all human and Islamic norms. There are over 70 such condemnations, joint and singular condemnations, and links to many others on that UNC website. MuslimsCondemn.com is another website. It lists over 7,000 condemnations of terrorism, and that I checked only last fall. So I'm sure the number is higher now. And so that site actually includes civil society groups as well as authorities. The denunciations of terror all hinge on the same principles. Islamic law forbids killing civilians. It also forbids declaration of war by anyone other than a duly recognized head of state. And even then it must be declared only as a last resort. Islamic law forbids hostage taking, killing political prisoners, the destruction of property unnecessarily, slavery, the mistreatment of women, the mistreatment of children. It forbids forced conversions. The anti-terrorism statements affirm Islam's commitment to protecting human rights, including religious freedom and the sanctity of life. All values clearly recognized in Islamic law and in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights issued in 1948. Actually, the only thing more common than questions about why Muslims don't condemn terrorist attacks is Muslim condemnations of terrorist attacks. They are there. It's just that our populations tend not to access them because they don't know where to look. Condemnations of terrorism don't make headlines the way terrorism does. Instead, people seem to be paralyzed by the fear induced by the headlines, by the attacks themselves. But unquestionably, from the perspective of the vast majority of Muslims, the global terrorists do not represent their religion. The terrorists are outliers. And if you read their own online statements, it's clear that the global terrorists know that they're outliers. In November 2014, Islamic State leader al-Baghdadi issued a message whose title was in colloquial Arabic, but it can be loosely translated, "So what if the mainstream Muslims hate us?" They clearly know that they're outliers. So what if the mainstream Muslims hate our global jihad, actually is what he called it. The terrorists know that most Muslims disagree with them. That's why they condemn mainstream Muslims as being brainwashed, gullible, as being apostates. Al-Baghdadi calls them a number of things. Among the things he calls them, criminal sorcerers. He calls them dogs, slaves, and, my favorite, effeminate. I don't know why that's an insult. They willingly accept humiliation and degradation at the hands of the Crusaders and the Jews, according to Baghdadi. Mainstream Muslims and mainstream Muslim leaders willingly accept subjugation at the hands of Crusaders and Jews. That's why they hate them. In fact, terrorists try to capitalize on their outlier status in their recruitment messages. Their claims of triumph over the elites, these effeminate dogs, they're triumphing over them, and they pitch their claims of triumph, especially to those who feel most rejected by the elites. The marginalized underclass, the unemployed, those who feel most rejected by the mainstream. And their recruitment, if you've seen their sites, their recruitment is very slick, it's very systematic. They appeal both to their target audience's frustrations and their desire for vengeance against a world that seems to have rejected them. In other words, playing on people's fears and sense of marginalization. Studies based on interviews with captured ISIS fighters show that they express a strong sense of alienation from their environments and discontent with their social and political status. Most revealing in these studies is the fact that proportionately Western Muslims who feel the sting of discrimination in white Christian majority communities are far more likely to be successfully recruited by ISIS than Muslims living in Muslim majority communities. This is, I think, an unfortunate reflection of Euro-American xenophobia. When Muslims or people with dark skin or people who are even perceived to be Muslims because they wear something unusual in the view of Euro-Americans on their head, or they have their hair different, their beards, whatever it is. People who are perceived to be Muslims, even if they're not, they suffer the same kinds of attacks. In fact, the first civilian who was murdered after 9/11 in the US was a Sikh. assumed to be a Muslim and therefore somehow responsible for the 9/11 attacks. So the outlier status of the global terrorists explains why the majority of their victims are Muslim. It also that outlier status also began long before 9/11. One of the forerunners of Al-Qaeda was an Egyptian terrorist organization that became infamous for assassinating President Anwar Sadat in 1981. That was a standard political assassination. I hate to use that phrase, but we do know that there is such a thing as standard political assassinations ever since Caesar, at least. Standard political assassination. The assassins condemned Sadat for his authoritarian ways and his collaboration with the United States and Israel despite Israel's illegal occupation of Palestinian territory. But the rationale offered by those assassins was unique. Instead of the standard sic semper tyrannis, as Brutus put it, and which is actually the motto of the state of Virginia, where I used to teach, and I think it was Thomas Jefferson who suggested that, correct? Thomas Jefferson, a founding father of the United States, suggested the motto of the state of Virginia, thus always to tyrants. But instead of saying, thus always to tyrants, for the first time, these assassins in Egypt said that it was Sadat's political actions, very unique. Sadat's political actions demonstrated that he was Muslim in name only, and therefore that he was an apostate, and therefore he deserved capital punishment. And since the state wasn't going to carry out the capital punishment, since Sadat was the head of the state, they took it upon themselves to kill him. That was 1981. Now, the process of declaring a professed Muslim an apostate was condemned in Islamic law over 1,000 years ago. That's another violation of Islamic law, but they didn't care. It's what, again, accounts for the overwhelming fear of terrorists expressed by Muslims. Because the terrorists think they can violate Islamic law and declare them a non-Muslim and therefore kill them. And they do. So that fear was expressed in a Pew Research Center Global Attitudes project conducted in 2014. And for example, 92% of people questioned registered growing fear of terrorism. The fact that these terrorist attacks were multiplying, increasing, and increasingly targeting Muslims was a growing trend, and Muslims were as confused as everyone else about where this came from and what to do about it. They were the majority of victims. So, terrorists do not represent Islam in the view of the majority of Muslims. What do they represent? Political turmoil. Political turmoil in the formerly colonized world. And that turmoil concerns everyone who suffers from it. Another way to put that, recognizing that mainstream Muslims condemn terrorist strategies does not mean that they don't share certain grievances against Western political policies. So this is a key distinction. While opinion polls demonstrate that vast majorities of Muslims reject terrorism, they also show profound concern with some of the same issues addressed by terrorist groups. Israel's occupation of Palestine, number one, in violation of UN Security Council resolution. Russia's repression of Chechnyan rights and other people's rights. India's failure to let Kashmiris determine their political future, for example. The plight of Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar, which Al-Qaeda pointed out long before many in the West had ever heard of Rohingya, or Myanmar for that matter. Muslim majorities express serious frustration with Western policies that seem to turn a blind eye to these concerns. Muslim majorities also share opposition to Western support for authoritarian governments in Egypt, in Saudi Arabia, and elsewhere. And even more so, they oppose US-led wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, and support for the Saudi-led war in Yemen. So, the vast majority of Muslims reject terrorism and share commitment to universal human rights. And Muslims suffer from terrorism even more than the West. In addition, they suffer from the West's confusion of terrorism with Islam. Public opinion polls show that Muslims are very concerned about Western public opinion that seems unable to distinguish between terrorism and mainstream Islamic values. But while mainstream Muslims believe the West shows little respect for their religion, little understanding of it, they don't share the terrorist view that the West is literally at war with Islam. Sometimes it seems that way because of the wars that are being conducted in Muslim-majority countries, because of the global war on terrorism. But many Muslims appreciate Western leaders when they acknowledge that Western countries, most leaders of Western countries say they're not at war with Islam, they're only at war with terrorism. And the majority of Muslims express appreciation for that distinction. And that's a significant difference because the terrorists actually literally believe that the West is trying to destroy Islam. They literally believe that. And therefore, they believe that their anti-West campaigns are defensive. This is their analysis. It's not shared by the majority, but that is their analysis. So in other words, most Muslims are not against the West. In fact, millions of Muslims are Western. This is something that's frequently overlooked. Significant minorities in the West are Muslim citizens, active participants in civil society, even in government, in business. Again, making this phrase, is Islam an enemy of the West, incomprehensible. But, like many non-Muslims, they share and in fact are strongly opposed to certain Western political policies. So this little book shows that the major differences between mainstream Muslims and the West lie not in values, as the clash of civilizations hypothesis would have. There aren't differences in values, but in certain political concerns. And that the major differences between mainstream Muslims and terrorists lies not in their political concerns necessarily, but in their values and their strategies, in the ways they understand political issues, in the goals they formulate, and in the strategies they use to achieve their goals. So this book, I'm not trying to sell books, just so you know how the argument goes, finishes with a brief overview of mainstream approaches to political challenges. Like any other people, Muslims want just and effective governance. Nobody doesn't want just and effective governance. Nobody doesn't like Vivaldi. No one doesn't like chocolate. And no one doesn't want just and effective governance. We're human beings. And as we have been studying this month here at PISAI, most Muslims express support for representative government, government by consent of the governed, rule of law, and human rights. They believe that these are all in accordance with Islamic principles and that Western policies often undermine those goals. But instead of attacking the West in order to achieve their goals, the majority work through peaceful means at local, national, and international levels to achieve their goals. Terrorist attacks, wars, and revolutions make headlines. What doesn't make headlines are the ongoing daily struggles for political reform and economic development. Efforts to promote democracy and development have been making gradual progress in Muslim-majority countries since the 19th century. Over 100 years ago, when most of the Muslim-majority world was ruled by European colonial powers. Modernizing movements calling for self-determination and democratic governance suffered setbacks during both world wars. But they continue, and some have made significant progress. So this book looks at Indonesia, for example, home of the world's largest Muslim population, and Tunisia, home of the Muslim world's newest democratic transition. It also looks at civil society activism to promote social services and human rights. These represent majority Muslim values and provide more evidence that Islam is not an enemy of the West. Understanding the complexities of Islamic societies, nearly a quarter of the world's population, can seem like an overwhelming task, but it really isn't. Their challenges are similar to those facing other countries that were colonized by Europeans. There are nearly 50 Muslim-majority countries in the world, and almost all of them were victims of European imperialism. Some still are. Mayotte, for example, Muslim majority, is still part of France. Chechnya is still a part, which is where the Boston Marathon bombers families were from, part of Russia still. Most Muslim majority countries got their independence only in the last 50 years, 50, 60 years, and often with a great deal of effort. Yes, the petroleum industry has made some Muslims the richest people on earth, but those people are only a fraction of the global Muslim population. Maldistribution of wealth is an endemic problem. The richest states have the smallest populations. Oil-rich Abu Dhabi, for example, has under 500,000 citizens. Fewer people than Seattle, my hometown, or Dublin, my great-grandmother's hometown. And an average annual income of nearly $100,000 per person. But of the world's 1.7 billion Muslims, nearly a quarter of the world's population, the majority live in oil-poor Asia. Indonesia, Pakistan, Indonesia, Bangladesh have the world's largest Muslim populations. Pakistan, with a population of 185 million people. Some are very rich, but the majority live on under $4 a day. Perhaps 1/3 of the world's Muslims live in Africa, where maldistribution of resources is also a major issue. In Nigeria, for example, Africa's largest country and home of Africa's richest man, the majority of the population lives on under $2 a day. So, like all formerly colonized countries, Muslim-majority countries have had to deal with stunted economic and political development, social problems resulting from those challenges, And the longer the struggle for economic and political development is prolonged, the more frustrated people become. Extreme frustration with the process accounts for the radicalization of some Muslims. There's a popular Palestinian hip-hop group called Dam. Do you know Dam? Which means blood in Arabic. Dam. It raps about the irony of being accused of terrorism when they protest the illegal occupation of their land. Min Irhabi. Who's the terrorist is the name of the song. It's a famous line. It says that the rape of the Arab soul spawned the suicide bomber in Palestine. And that sentiment can be found elsewhere in Muslim majority populations, those populations increasingly victimized by terrorism and increasingly having that problem added to their post-colonial democratic and economic challenges. So people who have studied the subject of colonial and post-colonial trauma, people who study these realities recognize that the morphing of anti-colonial guerrilla warfare and post-colonial marginalization into international terrorism among an even more marginalized few. Not to mention today's massive refugee crisis, these are results of policies that favor the powerful and neglect the poor. The West's militarism, the West's war on terror. There was, after all, no ISIS before the US-led invasion of Iraq in 2003. So to conclude, the majority of Muslims are not radicalized, but understanding what motivates both terrorists and mainstream Muslims, and the profound differences between their strategies, allows us to make sense of what seems to be the explosion of global jihadi groups that so frighten people like Geert Wilders, Marine Le Pen, Robert Spencer, and President Trump. It allows us to distinguish between mainstream agendas, whether expressed in Islamic terms or not, and radicalized militant movements that only add to the list of challenges faced by the majority. It allows recognition that Islam is not an enemy of the West, and that making policies based on that idea is counterproductive. And it opens up space for discussion of what would be effective, what would be effective responses to threats, terrorist threats to the West. Most Muslims are opposed to Western interference in their countries. Western intervention has obviously been ineffective in reducing terrorist attacks. At the same time, the West's militarism increases its own vulnerability, which, as it turns out, is in fact a primary goal of the Maoist strategies consciously employed by the so-called Islamic terrorists. This little book discusses the chief strategist of Al-Qaeda and ISIS. His name is Abu Musab Asuri. Well, his nom de guerre is Asuri. Mustafa Said Maryam, what we think is his real name. His strategic manual is directly modeled on Mao's strategy, which was known as War of the Flea, if anyone has heard of that. Mao's guerrilla strategy was famously known as War of the Flea. The most successful method of guerrilla warfare actually was used also by Che and General in Vietnam, General Giap. Yep, General Giap, using the same strategy, the same strategic manual, War of the Flea. It's the war of a beleaguered few against a giant enemy. And Mao, in his humorous way, darkly humorous way, used the metaphor of fleas attacking a huge dog. he went into detail, it's pretty disgusting, I won't go into it. But Suri takes that name, War of the Fleet, and changes it to Harb al-Mustazifin. Instead of War of the Fleet, War of the Dispossessed. So he gives it an Islamic sounding name. So, recognizing the values of Muslim majorities, which are recognizable, those values recognizable to most people worldwide. Human rights, civil liberties, economic development, peace, dignity. Recognizing that indicates that a far more effective way to combat terrorism than militarism, more effective than supporting authoritarian governments and continued military strikes, would be working with global partners to address people's legitimate political grievances, forging alliances with regional governments to enhance human security, economic and social development. Quote from the wise veteran statesman Prince Hassan of Jordan, who said, "Human security is, after all, absolutely essential to political security." Thank you.